Imagine words written thousands of years ago in the Sanskrit of ancient India. A single projectile charged with all the power in the universe. It was an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. Hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without cause. Birds turned white. When you first hear such descriptions in the Mahabharata, one of humanity's oldest and most revered epics, your mind reaches for metaphor. Surely this was poetry, an attempt by pre-scientific minds to capture the fury of storms or the wrath of gods in words. And yet the phrases linger, brighter than 10,000 suns, bodies burned beyond recognition, fallout echoing radiation sickness. These are not the images of lightning or ordinary battle. They are images our modern world associates with only one thing: nuclear war. And here lies the question that will not die. Is it possible that what we think of as the apex of modern science, the splitting of the atom, the mushroom cloud, the annihilation of cities, was already known, already unleashed by civilizations long before ours? The ordinary story of humanity tells us no. According to our textbooks, atomic weapons are inventions of the 20th century, born in the laboratories of Los Alamos, tested first in the deserts of New Mexico, and used only twice in war at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Civilization itself, we are told, is only about 10,000 years old, rising from the ashes of the last ice age. Before that, humans were hunters and gatherers, scratching survival from the earth with stone tools, ignorant of metallurgy, mathematics, and certainly nuclear physics. This is the timeline we trust. Progress from simplicity to complexity, from caves to cathedrals, from myths to machines. It is neat, linear, and comforting. But what happens when the earth itself tells a different story? What happens when we find ruins vitrified into glass, skeletons laced with radiation, layers of desert fused by heat beyond the reach of volcanoes or lightning? What happens when the texts we dismiss as myth seem to describe, with eerie precision, the technology we believe to be uniquely ours? These are not isolated curiosities. They appear in multiple corners of the world, whispered in myth, etched in stone, buried in the soil. And they force us to ask, is our timeline wrong? Is it possible that we are not the first civilization to harness the atom, but merely the latest? For the seeker, this is the beginning of the journey. It starts with doubt, the refusal to believe that our ancestors, living millennia before the pyramids, could possess knowledge we barely control today. And yet, the anomalies persist. The Mahabharata speaks of a weapon that could destroy a whole city with all its inhabitants and warriors. The Ramayana describes flying craft hurling beams of fire from the sky. These texts, written centuries before Christ, contain details that feel strangely modern, uncomfortably precise. The ordinary world of the textbook cannot account for this. It tells us myths are myths, nothing more. But the cracks in that certainty widen the deeper we look. Consider the parallels. When we read about a projectile exploding with the brilliance of 1,000 suns, we think of the Trinity test at Alamogordo in 1945, when J. Robert Oppenheimer recalled a verse from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He was not reaching for Shakespeare or Homer or the Bible. He was reaching for Sanskrit, for ancient words that had already described what he had just witnessed. Why? Because those words were uniquely apt, because the ancients had written about devastation of a kind no human should have known. Yet this is only the beginning. If we are to follow this thread, we must move beyond words into the earth itself, into ruins that melt like wax under unimaginable heat, into skeletons with radiation levels no natural process should explain, into deserts where sheets of glass shimmer under the sun, glass not from industry or fire, but from energies equal to modern nuclear tests. The ordinary world resists this. It clings to natural explanations, lightning, meteors, volcanic eruptions, and sometimes those explanations suffice, but other times they do not. Other times the evidence presses too close to the descriptions of ancient texts, too aligned with what we know of atomic fire, for dismissal to feel complete. So the seeker stands at the edge of certainty. On one side, the story of linear progress, of human history as we have written it: agriculture, cities, metallurgy, modern science. On the other, whispers of an older story, a cyclical one, civilizations rising, falling and rising again, each discovering the same dangerous fire, each perhaps meeting the same end. If this is true, then our place in history is not as pioneers, but as inheritors. We are not the first to wield the atom. We are only the first in memory. And that changes everything. It means that our myths may be memories. It means that our ruins may hold evidence of knowledge we believe impossible. It means that the line between past and present is thinner, darker, and more fragile than we care to admit. This is the unsettling possibility the seeker must face: that the story of nuclear war did not begin in the 20th century, that it may have happened before, that its evidence lies not in archives or laboratories but in plain sight, in texts, in ruins, in deserts, in myths. The journey begins here, in the comfort of the timeline we trust. But comfort is fragile. For beneath the soil of India, beneath the stones of Mohenjo-Daro, beneath the verses of the Mahabharata, whispers of another story stir. The seeker must decide: do we dismiss these as coincidence, as exaggeration, as metaphor? Or do we allow ourselves to wonder, dangerously, humbly, if the ancients once held knowledge as devastating as our own? Because if they did, then our history is not what we think. Our origins are not where we imagine, and our future, our fragile nuclear future, may not be a first but a repetition. The comfort of the ordinary world is already slipping. The adventure has begun. Every journey into the unknown begins with a spark, a discovery that unsettles the ordinary world and forces us to step beyond it. For the story of ancient nuclear war, that spark does not lie only in myth, but in the dust of real cities, buried beneath centuries of silence. In 1922, archaeologists working in the Indus Valley uncovered the ruins of a vast city, Mohenjo-Daro. At first glance, it seemed to confirm the narrative of early civilization: brick houses, streets laid in grids, drainage systems advanced for their age. Here, in what is now Pakistan, a Bronze Age people had built one of humanity's earliest urban centers. It was impressive but not revolutionary, until researchers looked closer. Scattered across the streets were skeletons, dozens of them, frozen in strange postures, lying as if death had come suddenly and violently. Some clutched hands, others sprawled as though fleeing. Unlike typical burials, these bodies bore no sign of ritual care. They seemed caught in the midst of catastrophe. And stranger still, tests on some of the remains revealed radiation levels that could not be explained by natural decay alone. How could a city that existed 4,000 years ago hold bodies as radioactive as those exposed near Hiroshima? Even more puzzling was the state of the ruins themselves. In sections of the city, the brickwork bore signs of having been subjected to extreme heat, so intense that the material had fused into a glassy surface. This vitrification is not the product of ordinary fire. It requires temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius, the kind produced today only in furnaces, nuclear blasts, or meteor strikes. And yet, there was no evidence of an asteroid impact, no crater, no natural event to explain the destruction. It was as if the city had been obliterated by a weapon far beyond its time. The discovery shocked those willing to consider its implications. Could Mohenjo-Daro have been the site of an ancient war, one fought with technology we thought belonged only to our own century? Was this the physical counterpart to the mythic battles described in the Mahabharata, where divine weapons annihilated armies with searing heat and blinding light? The call to adventure deepened as other anomalies surfaced. In Rajasthan, skeletons were found buried in strata that registered radiation far above background levels. In northern India, soil samples revealed traces of fused glass, indistinguishable from the trinitite produced at the first atomic test in Alamogordo. Thousands of miles away in Scotland, ancient forts were discovered with stones fused into glass walls, vitrified fortresses whose destruction mirrored the aftermath of an atomic explosion. Each site seemed to whisper the same disturbing possibility. At some point in deep antiquity, the Earth had been scarred by forces that modern humans only rediscovered in the 20th century. And yet the most compelling part of this call to adventure is not the ruins, but the words that align with them. The Mahabharata tells of a weapon called the Brahmastra, capable of destroying entire cities with firestorms and shockwaves. It describes the aftermath of battles where hair and nails fell out, pots broke without cause, and birds turned white. These are not the images of ordinary war. They echo radiation poisoning, fallout, and the invisible hand of atomic fire. Skeptics argue that ancient poets were simply exaggerating, borrowing the language of the sun to describe battle. But the parallels are uncanny. When Oppenheimer reached for words to describe the flash of the first atomic bomb, he quoted not Shakespeare nor the Psalms, but the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." The resonance was too precise to ignore, and so the seeker faces the call. Are these ruins and these texts coincidences, metaphors, natural phenomena misinterpreted? Or are they fragments of a memory, evidence of a history far older and darker than we are willing to accept? The ordinary world resists. Mainstream scholars explain the vitrification as accidental fires, the skeletons as disease victims, the myths as allegory. And sometimes these explanations suffice, but other times they falter. They do not account for the radiation levels. They do not explain the uniformity of vitrification across distant sites. They do not resolve the eerie alignment between mythic descriptions and modern nuclear events. This is the tension of the call, between dismissal and wonder, between certainty and possibility. To follow the path is to risk ridicule, to step outside the safety of accepted history. But the anomalies demand attention. They beckon the seeker forward. For if even one of these sites, Mohenjo-Daro, Rajasthan, vitrified forts, Libyan desert glass, holds truth beyond natural explanation, then our history must be rewritten. It would mean that human beings, or beings like us, once wielded knowledge as advanced and destructive as our own. It would mean that we are not the first to discover the atom, but inheritors of a legacy older than memory. This call is not easy to accept. It threatens the entire edifice of human history, the comfort of progress from primitive to modern. But it is also irresistible. The ruins are there, the texts are written, the anomalies are measurable, and the questions will not go away. The seeker, now drawn in, must decide: do we follow this call into the dust, into the ruins, into the heart of myths that may not be myths at all? Or do we turn back, clinging to the safety of the ordinary timeline? But the call to adventure is never without urgency. For if ancient civilizations did indeed wield nuclear power, then their fate may be a warning as well as a revelation. Their ruins may not be only evidence but prophecy. They may tell us not only what once happened, but what could happen again. The seeker cannot ignore this. The dust of Mohenjo-Daro, the glass of Rajasthan, the words of the Mahabharata, they demand pursuit. They demand that we cross the threshold into the unknown. The call has been heard. The journey deepens. The dust conceals secrets that could change everything we know. And so the seeker steps forward into the shadows of the ruins, where silence hides answers too long ignored. Every great journey into the unknown encounters resistance, not only from the dangers of the path itself, but from those who insist the path should never be walked at all. For the idea of ancient nuclear war is not merely controversial, it is heretical. It shakes the foundations of archaeology, history, and science. And so, from the moment the call to adventure is heard, there rises a chorus of refusal. Mainstream scholarship has always been cautious, even suspicious, of claims that defy the accepted timeline. Archaeologists insist that Mohenjo-Daro's vitrified ruins could be the product of natural fires or structural collapse. They note that the radiation levels in Rajasthan may have geological explanations or contamination from modern industry. They argue that the Sanskrit texts are allegory, the grand language of epic poetry, never meant to be read literally. And at first glance, these objections seem reasonable. Human history, as carefully reconstructed by generations of scholars, is a fragile edifice of pottery shards, carbon dates, and painstaking excavation. To claim that this edifice conceals evidence of ancient nuclear war is to call the entire discipline into question. It is to accuse centuries of scholarship of missing the most extraordinary truth imaginable. Such accusations are not welcomed. The refusal also comes from the structure of academia itself. Institutions are built on consensus. Theories must pass peer review, survive replication, and fit within established paradigms. Radical claims without undeniable evidence are dismissed, not always because they are false, but because they threaten the coherence of the system. To suggest that an advanced civilization wielded nuclear fire thousands of years ago is to leap far outside the comfort zone of that system, and so the guardians of orthodoxy push back. The language of refusal is often absolute. Skeptics claim that vitrified stone can be explained by ordinary conflagrations. They point to natural events, such as lightning strikes, as possible causes of melted ruins. They note that radiation in ancient skeletons might be the result of minerals in the soil, not fallout from ancient weapons. They argue that the Mahabharata's descriptions of weapons brighter than 1,000 suns are metaphor, just as Homer's epics describe gods hurling thunderbolts without anyone suspecting actual electricity. And yet beneath this refusal lies unease, for the anomalies do not disappear. The vitrified forts of Scotland are not explained by simple fire. The Libyan desert glass stretches for miles, requiring heat beyond volcanic eruption. The alignment between nuclear symptoms and Sanskrit passages is too precise to dismiss without a trace of discomfort. The refusal is strong, but it is not absolute. It is defensive. The seeker must face this wall of resistance and recognize its roots. Part of it is intellectual caution. Scholars fear being led astray by sensationalism, as past generations were by wild theories of Atlantis or ancient astronauts. They fear that to indulge such claims is to weaken the credibility of science itself. And part of it is human pride. To accept that ancients may have wielded knowledge beyond ours is to admit that we are not the pinnacle of human progress, but perhaps just one more turn in a cycle of rise and fall. The refusal also stems from evidence not yet conclusive enough. The skeletons at Mohenjo-Daro may be radioactive, but contamination is difficult to rule out. The fused ruins may resemble atomic blasts, but so too can lightning or cosmic impacts. The texts may echo nuclear imagery, but poetic exaggeration is always possible. Without a smoking gun, a reactor core, a melted weapon, an unmistakable isotopic fingerprint, mainstream science holds its ground. And yet the very vehemence of the refusal reveals something more. When scholars protest too strongly, when they dismiss too absolutely, it often betrays a fear that the anomaly may be real, that the myth may hold truth, that history may need rewriting. For what could be more disruptive than the revelation that nuclear technology, the defining symbol of modernity, was not unique to us? That we are not pioneers but heirs, not the first but the repeat. The seeker feels the weight of this refusal. It is daunting to stand against the guardians of accepted history, to risk ridicule, to chase shadows that may prove illusions. It is easier to turn back, to accept the safe narrative of gradual progress, to dismiss the whispers of nuclear fire in the past. Many do. The ordinary world is comfortable. Why risk its collapse? But myths do not rest. Ruins do not vanish. Anomalies do not disappear. They wait, stubborn and silent, for the seeker brave enough to look again. The refusal may be strong, but it is not final. It is only the test of resolve, the challenge that forces the seeker to decide, retreat into comfort or press on into danger. For if the refusal is accepted, the story ends here. Mohenjo-Daro remains a Bronze Age city, nothing more. The Mahabharata remains poetry, no different than Homer. The desert glass remains a curiosity of geology. The anomalies remain scattered curiosities, never to be woven into a larger truth. But if the seeker resists the refusal, the path continues. The ruins, the texts, the evidence will be re-examined, not with credulity, but with courage. The possibility will remain alive, however dangerous it may be. And here lies the deeper truth of the refusal. It is necessary. Every great revelation must face skepticism, must withstand resistance, must prove itself against the strongest objections. Without refusal, there is no test. Without test, there is no transformation. The refusal, then, is not an end, but a crucible. The seeker, standing before the wall of academic resistance, hears the voices of doubt. Coincidence, misinterpretation, exaggeration. They echo like thunder, demanding retreat. But behind those voices, faint and insistent, whisper the words of the Mahabharata. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishnis and the Andakas. Are these metaphors or memories? The refusal cannot silence the question. It can only sharpen it. And so the seeker, though tempted to turn back, chooses to press on. The mentor awaits, the texts themselves, preserved across millennia, filled with clues too precise to ignore. The wall of resistance has been faced. The journey continues. Every seeker on the path encounters a mentor, a guide who reveals truths that lie hidden beneath the surface. In this journey, the mentors are not living sages or modern scientists, but voices carried forward across thousands of years, bound in Sanskrit verse. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana, India's monumental epics, are more than poetry. They are repositories of memory, passages that whisper of weapons and wars far beyond the capabilities of Bronze Age humanity. The Mahabharata, composed between 400 BCE and 400 CE, though rooted in far older oral traditions, is among the longest epics ever written. Its central tale is a dynastic war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, but within its verses lie descriptions of technologies and catastrophes that seem impossibly advanced. One passage describes a weapon called the Brahmastra, a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns rose in splendor. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death which reduced to ashes entire races. The language is chilling, 10,000 suns, a weapon that can annihilate not one warrior, not one army, but entire peoples. The aftermath is equally haunting. The corpses were burned beyond recognition. The survivors were stricken with sickness. Hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without cause. Birds turned white. To the modern reader, these are not metaphors of ordinary war. They are the symptoms of radiation, fallout, and nuclear devastation. The Ramayana too speaks of flying machines, vimanas, that launch weapons from the sky. It tells of battles where fiery projectiles rain down, igniting forests, boiling rivers, and turning day into night. One weapon is said to have caused winds blowing like a storm, burning everything. The earth shook, mountains split, and animals perished. These are not the swords and arrows of Bronze Age combat. They are images of shockwaves, seismic destruction, environmental collapse, effects eerily consistent with nuclear blasts. If these passages stood alone, one might dismiss them as poetic exaggerations. Ancient authors often describe the wrath of gods in fiery terms, yet the specificity here is striking. The image of corpses burned beyond recognition, survivors losing hair and nails, and food becoming contaminated, does not resemble lightning, volcanoes, or storms. It mirrors the documented accounts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The uncanny alignment begs the question, how could ancient poets describe, with such precision, phenomena they should never have known? The mentor role of these texts is twofold. First, they preserve memory, if not literal, then at least symbolic. They remind us that myths often encode truths. Flood myths around the world, once dismissed as allegory, now align with evidence of sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. Could war myths, once dismissed as divine metaphor, encode memory of technological catastrophes in deep prehistory? Second, these texts guide us by forcing confrontation. They do not allow the seeker to remain comfortable. They demand the unsettling question, were these verses merely the imagination of poets or the testimony of survivors? Mainstream scholars argue for imagination. They note that epics are layered with symbolism intended to glorify kings and gods. The Brahmastra, they say, is a metaphor for divine wrath, not a literal bomb. The sickness and fallout are allegories for the moral corruption of war. And yet, the seeker cannot ignore the uncanny precision. When metaphors overlap perfectly with later scientific reality, coincidence feels less like explanation and more like avoidance. The texts also describe restrictions on the use of these weapons. The Brahmastra is said to be so devastating that it could only be unleashed under extreme necessity, and even then, its use risked cosmic imbalance. This mirrors the ethical dilemmas of our own age, the doctrine of deterrence, the taboo of nuclear war. Ancient authors not only described weapons of immense power, but also the moral crises that accompanied them. Were they imagining or remembering? Another passage from the Mahabharata describes warriors blinded by the weapon's brightness, rivers drying up and crops failing. These echoes sound not like swords, but like fallout winters. The Ramayana's Vimanas, meanwhile, suggest aerial delivery systems, craft hurling projectiles from the skies. For centuries, these were read as fantasy, yet in the age of jet aircraft and ballistic missiles, they resonate with disturbing familiarity. The seeker, guided by these mentors, begins to see the pattern. Myths are not merely stories, but memory encoded in metaphor. Where direct explanation was impossible, poets framed catastrophe in terms of gods and demons. Yet beneath the divine imagery lies technological detail, details that fit uncomfortably well with modern nuclear science. Consider also the cultural reverence for these weapons. They are not treated as common arms, but as sacred, forbidden, world-altering. They are linked to gods like Brahma and Shiva, tied to cosmic balance, and feared for their apocalyptic potential. This is not how ancient cultures spoke of ordinary weapons. It is how modern humanity speaks of the bomb, as something transcendent, catastrophic, almost divine in its power to end civilizations. The seeker cannot help but notice the symmetry. The 20th century birthed the atom bomb, and poets like Oppenheimer turned instinctively to the Bhagavad Gita for words to describe it. The 20th century tested atomic fire, and the desert of New Mexico bloomed into trinitite, glass formed by heat. The ancients described fire from the sky, corpses burned, hair falling out, and the earth scarred. Across millennia, the same language, the same awe, the same dread. The texts, acting as mentors, do not give final answers. They never do. Instead, they awaken questions too urgent to ignore. Could it be that the Mahabharata and Ramayana are not only epics but also records? Could it be that behind their divine metaphors lie testimonies of wars fought with weapons that erase cities, that poison survivors, that alter the earth itself? Skeptics scoff, but the seeker feels the pull. The ruins in Mohenjo-Daro and Rajasthan echo the texts. The vitrified forts in Scotland, the desert glass in Libya align with the imagery. The question is no longer academic, it is existential. If these texts preserve memories of nuclear war, then human history is not what we think. Civilization is not a straight line but a cycle, one in which our species has already courted annihilation. The mentor has spoken. The words are preserved. They guide us deeper into the cave of mystery, demanding we cross into the realm of archaeology and science, where soil and stone may confirm what verse has long whispered. The seeker has listened. The comfort of metaphor is gone. The weight of possibility presses heavy. If the ancients wielded nuclear fire, the ruins will bear its mark. And so the journey moves forward, away from text and into earth, across the threshold where myth meets material. Every seeker must eventually step beyond words into the weight of the world itself. Myths may whisper, but stone and soil cannot lie. To cross the threshold in this journey is to leave behind the safety of metaphor and plunge into the ruins where the earth itself may hold the scars of forgotten wars. The most famous of these thresholds lies in the Indus Valley, Mohenjo-Daro, the Mound of the Dead. At first glance, it is an archaeologist's dream, a planned city of the Bronze Age, its streets laid in straight lines, its drains carved with precision, its homes built with fired brick. But beneath this veneer of order lies chaos, frozen in time. Skeletons lie strewn in the streets, as if death came suddenly, leaving no time for ritual burial. Some lie clutching one another, others collapsed in postures of panic. Unlike mass graves or plague pits, these bodies show no orderly placement. They suggest catastrophe, not disease. And in the ruins themselves, the stones bear witness to something stranger still. In several locations, walls and floors are fused together, as though melted by heat too intense for any ordinary fire. Brick, once carefully stacked, now flows like liquid, hardened again into a glassy mass. Modern furnaces can replicate such vitrification, as can nuclear blasts, but ordinary fires, even great conflagrations, cannot. Mohenjo-Daro's stones bear the mark of an energy its supposed builders should never have possessed. The threshold widens in Rajasthan, where other skeletons have been unearthed bearing inexplicably high levels of radiation. Some researchers have claimed that the background radiation around these remains is many times higher than normal, as though fallout still lingered millennia later. Skeptics argue contamination or natural uranium deposits. But the alignment with texts that describe firestorms and sickness, with ruins that show vitrification, is too precise to dismiss outright. Far from India, in Scotland, the ruins of ancient forts tell a similar tale. Archaeologists have long puzzled over the vitrified forts, stone walls melted into glass, fused as if blasted by unimaginable heat. For decades, explanations have ranged from deliberate burning to accidents of construction. But no known ancient technique could produce temperatures high enough to vitrify such massive structures. The evidence whispers of forces unleashed far beyond torches and campfires. And then, the Libyan desert. Here, in one of the most barren regions on Earth, lies a field of glass. Yellow-green sheets scattered across hundreds of square kilometers. When first discovered, scientists wondered if the glass was volcanic, but there are no volcanoes nearby. Others proposed meteor strikes, but no crater has been found large enough to account for the scale of vitrification. The glass is nearly pure silica, requiring temperatures of over 1,600 degrees Celsius to form. The last time humans created such glass was in the deserts of New Mexico, when the Trinity test of 1945 turned sand into a substance we now call trinitite. Crossing this threshold, the seeker is confronted with a chilling pattern. Across continents and cultures, from India to Scotland to North Africa, the earth holds the same scars: stone turned to glass, sand fused into sheets, skeletons tainted with radiation. Myths describe fire brighter than suns. Texts tell of weapons that burn cities into ash, and the ruins themselves echo those words in silence. The ordinary world pushes back, clinging to natural explanations. Lightning can melt sand, meteors can create glass, volcanoes can spew fire. But lightning leaves craters, meteors leave shrapnel, volcanoes leave ash. None of these explanations fits all the sites, all the patterns, all the parallels with myth. The anomalies resist reduction. This is the moment of no return. The seeker has left the safety of accepted history. The evidence is too tangible, too physical to ignore. Mohenjo-Daro's skeletons, Rajasthan's radiation, vitrified forts, Libyan desert glass, each one is a threshold, each one a step deeper into a story mainstream history refuses to tell. And yet, as the seeker crosses this threshold, another realization dawns. Evidence alone is not enough. Stones and bones do not speak clearly. They require interpretation, and interpretation is a battleground. For every anomaly, skeptics marshal natural explanations. For every strange ruin, conventional history insists on coincidence. The seeker must move beyond thresholds into tests, into allies and enemies, into the crucible of competing visions. Still, the ruins remain, stubborn and undeniable. They do not vanish under dismissal. They do not retreat into metaphor. They remain fused, melted, scarred, silent witnesses to energies out of place in ancient times. The seeker now walks in a new world. The timeline of textbooks has cracked. The comfort of linear history is gone. The ruins stand as doors, thresholds into a deeper, stranger past. And through those doors, questions echo louder. Who unleashed this fire? How did they wield such power? And why has their story been buried, their knowledge lost? The seeker presses on. The threshold has been crossed. The ruins have spoken. Now come the tests. The struggle to prove whether the scars of stone are accidents of nature or the fingerprints of ancient nuclear war. Crossing into the ruins is only the beginning. Stones melted into glass and skeletons laced with radiation are striking, but they are mute without analysis. To truly weigh the anomalies, the seeker must call on allies, scientists, archaeologists, geologists, whose instruments can measure what the eye alone cannot. The journey now becomes a series of tests where evidence is probed, dissected, and debated. At Mohenjo-Daro, one of the first scientific questions raised was simple. What could have caused such sudden death in the streets? Ordinary explanations falter. Epidemics usually leave signs in the bones, evidence of disease, not corpses frozen in panic. Floods or fires leave distinct patterns. Here, instead, bodies were scattered abruptly, as though a catastrophe had struck with little warning. Radiological testing, though limited and often controversial, hinted at elevated levels in some remains. To skeptics, contamination explained it. To others, the readings whispered of fallout. The bricks themselves became test subjects. Modern furnaces reproduced their vitrification, but only at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius. Ancient kilns could not have reached such heat. Could an immense lightning strike explain it? Some suggested yes, but vitrification at Mohenjo-Daro occurs over broad areas, not narrow streaks. Could a meteor have struck? Yet there is no crater, no impact debris. The tests multiplied, but none silenced the question. Rajasthan presented its own puzzles. Soil samples taken from certain sites revealed radioactive isotopes, including traces of fused silica resembling trinitite. The glass formed during nuclear detonations. The levels were higher than background, though not universally conclusive. Skeptics argued the region's geology contains natural uranium deposits, but supporters noted the isotopic ratios echoed those found in areas affected by atomic tests. The line between natural and artificial blurred. In Scotland, scientists studying vitrified forts attempted to recreate their formation. Experimental archaeologists piled wood against stone walls and set them ablaze, hoping to reach the necessary heat. Fires burned hot, but not hot enough. Temperatures spiked into the hundreds of degrees, but vitrification requires thousands. The fort's fused walls remained stubbornly anomalous. Without modern furnaces, or something akin to a blast, the mystery persisted.
Then came the Libyan desert. The glass there covers hundreds of square kilometers, a sea of silica fused into sheets. Geologists puzzled over its origin. Volcanoes? None nearby. Lightning. Possible but insufficient for such scale. A meteor strike. Perhaps, but where was the crater? Some argued the impact site had eroded or been buried. Others pointed out that the glass's purity and distribution more closely resembled the glass formed at nuclear test sites. Tests revealed nearly identical structures between Libyan desert glass and trinitite from Alamogordo. The Earth itself seemed to bear scars of heat unleashed far beyond the reach of nature's ordinary hand. These tests did not prove nuclear war. They did not yield reactors buried in ruins or unmistakable weapons. But they also refused to exonerate conventional explanations. Each anomaly resisted easy classification. Each demanded further questioning.
And so, allies emerged, not in the form of definitive answers, but in the persistence of evidence that refused to go away. Geologists who admitted vitrification was too extreme for fire. Chemists who noted isotopic ratios resembling fallout. Historians who conceded the uncanny parallels between epic descriptions and modern nuclear effects. None declared certainty, but none closed the case. The tests also revealed something deeper, the limits of our imagination. We assume that what ancients built was constrained by what we believe they could build. We measure their abilities by tools and artifacts we have found. Yet absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge can be lost. Libraries can burn. If a people once grasped nuclear fire and then destroyed themselves with it, would we not expect their secrets to be buried in rubble and myth?
The tests force humility. Every measurement, every anomaly is a reminder that the past is stranger than we think. Allies in science push us to be rigorous, but also to remain open. Skeptics are necessary. They ensure that anomalies are not fantasies. But allies too are necessary. Those willing to ask questions without fear, to measure without dismissal, to wonder without ridicule.
And so the seeker gathers these allies, the texts of the Mahabharata and Ramayana with their haunting verses, the stones of Mohenjo-Daro and Rajasthan fused and scorched, the glass of Libya stretched across the desert, the forts of Scotland melted into silence. Each is a test. Each is an ally. Each pushes the seeker deeper into the cave. Yet the tests also heighten the stakes. If the anomalies are coincidence, then the story dissolves into nothing. If they are real, then our history is far older and darker than we admit. The seeker cannot turn back now. The evidence will not allow it. And so the journey presses forward toward the inmost cave, the symbolic heart where texts and ruins converge. There the seeker will face the ordeal, where natural explanations clash with the terrifying possibility that ancient civilizations did wield nuclear fire. The allies are gathered, the tests are underway, the ruins are restless. The seeker steps deeper into the shadows where myth and matter meet. The seeker has crossed the threshold, gathered allies, and endured the first wave of tests. Now comes the approach to the inmost cave, the symbolic heart of the mystery, where the evidence grows darker, the parallels sharper, and the possibility of ancient nuclear devastation harder to ignore. It is here, at this point in the descent, that the ground itself begins to burn back. The seeker looks down and sees not ruins shaped by time, but scars etched by fire. The soil, the stone, the very crust of the earth bears testimony. One of the most disturbing sights lies again in the Indus Valley. At Mohenjo-Daro, the city's skeletons are scattered, not laid in careful burials, but dropped where they fell. Some tests suggest radiation levels many times above normal background. And beneath these bones, the soil itself reveals fused clumps of silica, melted together as if struck by temperatures no ordinary fire could create. The earth, it seems, had liquefied and then cooled into hardened glass. The seeker recalls the words of the Mahabharata. The corpses were burned beyond recognition. The survivors were stricken with sickness. Hair and nails fell out, and then looks again at the fused ground, the shattered city. Myth and matter align in eerie chorus.
But Mohenjo-Daro is not alone. Across the deserts of Rajasthan, stretches of land appear seared, as though cleansed by flame that left no ash. Locals have long spoken of cursed soil, areas where crops would not grow, where animals refused to graze. Scientific surveys found traces of radioactive isotopes embedded in the earth. The ground itself carried a wound, not a fleeting burn, but a scar that lingered across generations.
And then there is Libya, where sheets of desert glass stretch for hundreds of kilometers. Silica fused into translucent yellow-green panes, scattered like fragments of a shattered window. Tests show the glass formed at temperatures exceeding 1,600 degrees Celsius, perhaps closer to 2,000. Such heat does not come from campfires or torches, nor from accidental blazes. Volcanoes, none in the region. Meteors, possible, yet the scale of distribution, the purity of the silica, and the absence of an obvious crater cast doubt. The comparison with trinitite, the glass left behind after the 1945 Trinity test, is almost uncanny. Two deserts, separated by millennia, fused by unimaginable heat. The seeker approaches the inmost cave with each anomaly. It is not one site, not one culture, but a pattern that spans continents: India, Scotland, Libya, all bearing scars of vitrification, fused glass, melted stone. The earth resists ordinary explanation. The ground burns back against the narrative of simplicity, against the timeline of steady, gradual progress. Symbolic evidence adds weight to the physical. The Mahabharata's descriptions of the Brahmastra weapon speak not only of blinding light and fiery columns, but also of aftermaths: poisoned food, rivers drying up, crops failing. The Ramayana's tales of Vimanas describe flying craft raining fire from above. Carvings at certain ancient sites depict figures wielding weapons that resemble rods or discs, not swords or spears. The vulture stone at Göbekli Tepe, though thousands of years older, appears to memorialize a comet strike, an image of cataclysm carved into stone. Across cultures, the symbolism is the same: fire from the sky, devastation from above, death that lingers in soil and water. The seeker stands at the threshold of the cave, confronted by these converging streams: myth and material, verse and vitrification. The texts describe what the earth confirms, and the earth bears scars that the texts explain. And yet the cave is dark, the answers elusive. For each fused stone, skeptics offer explanations: natural lightning strikes, meteor impacts, freak accidents of geology. For each radioactive reading, they propose contamination or uranium-rich soil. For each uncanny description in the Sanskrit texts, they argue metaphor, allegory, divine imagination. The seeker knows these interpretations must be weighed, but the alignment, the sheer symmetry between myth, material, and modern nuclear knowledge is too precise to dismiss. This is the heart of the ordeal. The seeker begins to see that the question is not only whether these anomalies can be explained by nature, but whether human history itself is built on denial. To admit the possibility of ancient nuclear war is to fracture the story of civilization, to admit that human beings may once have wielded technologies as destructive as, or greater than, our own. It is to admit that history is not a linear ascent, but a cycle of rise, catastrophe, and loss. The ground burns back with this realization. Every fused brick, every melted wall, every glassy shard is a torch in the darkness, illuminating what mainstream history prefers to leave unlit. And so the seeker presses deeper into the inmost cave itself, where the ordeal awaits. The confrontation with the possibility that quarks, atoms, and isotopes may testify not only to natural forces, but to the forgotten wars of ancient humans. For if these scars are not accidents of nature, then they are fingerprints. Fingerprints of a hand that once struck with fire beyond the comprehension of its time. Fingerprints of a civilization that rose, mastered the atom, and then destroyed itself, leaving behind ruins and verses, scars and shadows. The seeker hesitates at the cave's mouth. To go further is to face the ordeal, to accept that these hints might point not to imagination, but to memory. And in that hesitation, a chilling thought arises. If they once mastered the atom and fell, what does that mean for us? Standing now with our own arsenals poised, our own future fragile, our own soil one misstep away from bearing the same scars. The ground has spoken. It burns back against complacency, and the seeker must step forward into the fire of truth. The seeker has crossed thresholds, gathered allies, and walked into the inmost cave. Now comes the ordeal, the confrontation with evidence that is not vague, not metaphorical, but scientific. If myths and ruins whisper of firestorms, it is isotopes, elemental traces, and patterns of destruction that scream. For in these details lie the fingerprints of the atom, clues that bridge the gulf between ancient legend and modern apocalypse. In Rajasthan, scientists investigating the supposed radioactive zone uncovered soil samples with unusual isotopic ratios. Cesium-137, a fission byproduct, was reported in concentrations beyond what natural geology should explain. Thorium and uranium occur naturally, yes, but cesium-137 is another matter. It is a daughter isotope, born only from processes like nuclear detonation or reactor meltdown. Skeptics claim the data is flawed, the instruments misread, or the samples contaminated by modern industry. But if accurate, then the ground itself testifies to fire beyond ordinary flame, fire that split the nucleus. Other samples show fused silica with traces of cobalt and nickel isotopes altered in ways consistent with intense neutron bombardment. Such patterns are not found in normal volcanic or meteorite activity. They are signatures, fingerprints of atomic fire. At Mohenjo-Daro, the skeletons scattered in the streets were once reported to emit readings 30 to 50 times higher than expected background. Some geologists dismissed it as natural uranium in the soil, but the correlation between scorched ruins, vitrified stone, and isotopic anomalies remains too sharp to ignore. The ordeal deepens when we compare these ancient sites with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Photographs of Ground Zero in 1945 show bodies frozen mid-step, shadows burned into walls, and city blocks turned to fused rubble. At Mohenjo-Daro, the same pattern appears: skeletons collapsed in sudden death, walls melted into glassy flows, soil fused into unnatural clumps. The resemblance is uncanny. Survivors of Hiroshima spoke of hair falling out, nails loosening, and mysterious illnesses striking days after exposure. The Mahabharata describes the aftermath of the Brahmastra in the same words: hair and nails falling out, survivors stricken with sickness, food contaminated. Across thousands of years, the descriptions echo one another, as if separated not by culture, but by recurrence. The ordeal forces the seeker to confront scale. At Hiroshima, a bomb weighing a mere 4 tons unleashed devastation equal to 15,000 tons of TNT. It leveled a city in seconds, left glassy scars in stone, and poisoned generations with fallout. At Nagasaki, the blast generated firestorms hot enough to melt steel, shadows etched into walls, and isotopes lingering decades later. If such devastation could occur in the modern age, then the anomalies in Rajasthan, Mohenjo-Daro, and Libya suddenly seem less impossible. They seem instead like grim precedents. The ordeal also forces a chilling realization. Nuclear war is not merely about destruction in the moment. It is about aftermath. Fallout reshapes ecosystems. Isotopes linger, rewriting the chemistry of soil, water, and flesh. In Rajasthan, fields lay barren for centuries. In Mohenjo-Daro, the city was abandoned and never rebuilt. The scars were not just physical, they were civilizational. Once a nuclear blast occurs, recovery is generational. A thriving city becomes a ghost. A society may vanish into myth. Skeptics point to meteor impacts as explanations. The Tunguska event of 1908 flattened forests without leaving a crater, demonstrating the chaos of cosmic intrusions. But meteors leave chemical signatures: iridium, nickel, and shocked quartz. In Rajasthan and Libya, the isotopic anomalies tell another story. Not cosmic impact, but terrestrial fission. Not the hand of the heavens, but the hand of man. The ordeal sharpens with the recognition that these anomalies are not isolated. They align with mythic descriptions, with global ruins, with inexplicable glass fields. If it were one site, one anomaly, dismissal would be easy. But across continents, across epochs, the fingerprints repeat. The seeker cannot help but feel the presence of a pattern. And in that pattern lies the most unsettling question. Did someone in prehistory unleash the very same fire we feared in 1945? Did a civilization rise to the brink of mastery, split the atom, and turn its power on its rivals, only to erase itself? If so, then what we call progress is not a straight line but a loop. The 20th century may not have been the first age of the bomb, only the most recent. The ordeal is terrifying because it reflects us back to ourselves. The ancients may have fallen to the fire, and we stand now in their place, poised on the same precipice. Their texts warn of weapons too devastating to use, yet describe them used. Their ruins whisper of cities wiped out in moments, just as Hiroshima and Nagasaki were. Their soil testifies to isotopes that should not be there, just as our deserts testify to Trinity and Nevada. The seeker facing this ordeal feels the weight of history pressing down. If the ancients mastered nuclear fire, their story is our story. Their fall is a warning, their ruins a mirror. The fingerprints of the atom linger across time, reminding us that the power to annihilate is not new, only rediscovered. And so the seeker emerges from the ordeal shaken, burdened with a truth too heavy to carry and too urgent to ignore. The evidence, isotopic traces, fused soil, uncanny patterns of destruction, points to the same fire we know all too well. A fire that split the atom in ages long forgotten. A fire that erased civilizations and left us with ruins, myths, and silence. The ordeal ends not with answers, but with a question. If they unleashed it once, and we again, how many times can humanity dance with nuclear fire before history finally ends? The ordeal has passed. The seeker has stared into the cave and found, in isotopic ratios and fused stone, the fingerprints of the atom. Now comes the reward, not treasure in gold or jewels, but insight, a revelation that shifts the axis of human history itself. For if the ancients wielded nuclear fire, then the limits we place upon their capability are illusions. Civilization's story must be rewritten. The textbooks tell us that nuclear power was born in the 20th century, the child of fission experiments in Berlin, the Manhattan Project's frantic race, and the detonations over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In this story, technology is linear: stone to bronze, bronze to iron, iron to steam, steam to silicon, silicon to the atom, each step higher, each step forward. But the anomalies crack this tale. If cities thousands of years old bear isotopic scars, if epics thousands of years old describe fallout sickness and fire brighter than suns, then humanity's mastery of the atom did not begin with Oppenheimer. It began long before and was lost. The reward, then, is a new lens, that human history is not linear but cyclical. Civilizations rise, master forces too great to contain, and fall. Their knowledge is buried with them, their cities vitrified into glass, their myths transformed into legend. And later, millennia later, another civilization rises, discovers again, and stands once more at the brink. We are not the first. We are simply the latest. The seeker sees how the myths shift under this lens. The Mahabharata's Brahmastra, long dismissed as divine allegory, now reads as testimony. Its warnings of indiscriminate destruction, its taboos against misuse, mirror modern nuclear ethics. The Ramayana's Vimanas, hurling fiery projectiles, shift from fantasy into faint memory of aerial bombardment. The stories do not exaggerate. They encode. The poets were not inventing. They were preserving. The reward also lies in synthesis. The anomalies once scattered, Mohenjo-Daro's skeletons, Rajasthan's radiation, Libya's desert glass, Scotland's vitrified forts, now weave together into a coherent pattern. What once seemed isolated oddities now appear as evidence of a larger whole. Taken together, they tell a story too heavy to ignore, that advanced forces once raged across the earth, erasing civilizations and leaving scars in both soil and song. And here, the reward deepens. For if this rewriting of history is true, then our assumptions about ancient humanity collapse. We think of them as primitive, limited to bronze spears and stone temples. But what if they were our equals or our predecessors in mastery? What if their sciences reached heights we struggle to imagine, their understanding of energy and matter perhaps even surpassing ours? What if, in our arrogance, we are rediscovering what was once known rather than pioneering the unknown? The seeker recalls a haunting line, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Oppenheimer's words at Trinity, borrowed from the Bhagavad Gita. At the very moment humanity reawakened the atom, it reached back instinctively to Sanskrit verse, as though the knowledge had never been wholly lost, only buried, waiting to be spoken again. This realization is the boon. It is not certainty but perspective. It is the knowledge that myths may hold truth, that ruins may conceal testimony, that history is deeper and stranger than we allow. It is the awareness that we are not alone in time, that others have stood where we stand, weapon in hand, future in peril. The reward, however, carries weight. To rewrite human capability is to shatter the foundation of our identity. If the ancients could master nuclear fire, what else might they have known? Could they have understood astronomy beyond their age, medicine beyond our reckoning, physics that we call advanced but they considered familiar? Could the echoes of lost sciences ripple through alchemy, myth, and sacred geometry? Could the stone blocks of pyramids, the precision of megaliths, the alignments of temples, all be reinterpreted not as crude attempts, but as remnants of sophisticated knowledge? The seeker holds this reward with awe and dread, for every reward is double-edged. To admit lost mastery is to admit fragility. If they fell, we can fall. If their cities became mounds of glass and their stories became myth, then what assurance have we that ours will endure? Perhaps history will one day look back on Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Chernobyl, Fukushima, and see not progress but repetition. Still, the reward transforms. The seeker is no longer a passive inheritor of history, but an active participant in its rewriting. The anomalies demand recognition, the myths demand respect. The ruins demand reconsideration. Human capability cannot be measured by what survived, only by what once was possible. In this light, the entire story of civilization shifts. Agriculture, once thought the foundation of complexity, may have been preceded by technologies we can scarcely fathom. Monumental architecture, once thought impossible without vast slave labor, may reflect knowledge of energy and mechanics beyond our textbooks. Myth, once dismissed as fancy, may instead be the last whispers of truths too dangerous to repeat. The seeker emerges from the ordeal carrying this reward, the recognition that human history is not what we think. The past is not a straight line but a shadowed labyrinth, where ancient voices echo and ruins burn with hidden fire. We are heirs not only to their wisdom, but to their mistakes. And as the seeker looks around at our modern world, with missiles in silos, arsenals poised, and politicians balancing on the edge of catastrophe, the reward is both gift and curse. It warns us that the cycle is real, that mastery without wisdom leads not to progress but to ruin, that the fire of the atom, once unleashed, cares little for whether its wielder is ancient or modern. The reward, then, is not comfort but clarity. The ancients may have fallen, We may yet fall, but if we learn from their scars, if we heed their warnings, perhaps the cycle can be broken. Perhaps history does not need to repeat. The seeker holds the insight close. The myths are no longer myths. The ruins are no longer silent. The earth itself speaks, and its voice is grave. But even as the reward illuminates, new shadows gather. For if ancient civilizations wielded nuclear fire, what else did they know? What secrets remained buried, waiting to be unearthed? And why were their powers erased, their stories buried in allegory and doubt? The reward is transformation, but it comes with lingering questions. The seeker cannot rest yet. The road back awaits, where history and myth must be reconciled, where modern myths must be weighed against ancient ones.
For with every reward comes responsibility, and with every revelation comes resistance.
The seeker has received the reward, the recognition that ancient civilizations may have wielded forces far beyond what we imagined. Yet the journey is not complete. Every hero must take the road back, returning with the boon, carrying it into the wider world. Here that road winds through the myths of many cultures, each echoing with stories of fire from the sky, wars of the gods, and destruction so total it transcends ordinary disaster. Could these tales, scattered across continents, be fragments of a single memory, a catastrophe humanity endured, retold again and again as myth? In India, the Mahabharata and Ramayana tell of the Brahmastra, of flying vimanas, of weapons brighter than 1,000 suns. But India is not alone. In the Hebrew Bible, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is described with chilling familiarity, fire and brimstone raining down from the heavens, cities annihilated in an instant, the landscape turned barren and salted. Lot's wife, turned into a pillar of salt, recalls the sudden, searing force that transformed her body into something alien. To some, this is divine punishment. To others, it is a description of a weapon that burned hotter than any fire known to man. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian tales of Enlil and Enki speak of godly wars fought with terrible weapons, cities scoured by storms of fire. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a world scarred by cataclysm, rivers boiling, and survivors wandering in despair. The gods, it seems, did not only guide humanity, they fought among themselves, and their quarrels scorched the earth. Among the Hopi of North America, traditions speak of cycles of destruction and rebirth. In their account, a previous world ended when a red, destructive sun burned across the sky, leaving only a few survivors who sheltered underground. They emerged to rebuild, carrying the memory of fire that had wiped away their world. The Hopi warn that our current age, too, will end in fire if humanity strays too far from balance. The Norse myths tell of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, where the sun turns black, stars vanish, and the earth is consumed in flame before rising again, renewed. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs spoke of suns that came before our own age, each ending in catastrophe, floods, jaguars, wind and fire. Our present age, they said, is the fifth sun, destined too to collapse. These myths, separated by geography and culture, nevertheless converge. They all describe fire from above, wars of gods, destruction that wipes out cities or worlds, and survivors who emerge to rebuild. The seeker sees in them not fanciful allegories, but memories. Memories of a catastrophe so profound, it became embedded in humanity's deepest stories. The road back is not easy. Scholars argue that fire from the sky could mean comets, asteroids, or volcanoes. Sodom and Gomorrah could be metaphors for corruption and divine wrath. Ragnarok could be symbolic of seasonal cycles. The Hopi red sun could be a comet or supernova. The Aztec suns could be allegories for natural disasters. All this is possible. Yet the seeker notes the uncanny consistency. Fire bright as the sun, cities annihilated in moments, survivors stricken with sickness, cycles of destruction and rebirth. The seeker recalls how the survivors of Hiroshima described a sun exploding above them, shadows etched into stone, skin burning, as if the air itself had turned against them. If those events were remembered only as story, stripped of science, they would sound much like myth. Is it so unthinkable, then, that ancient survivors of nuclear fire told their descendants the same, weaving memory into myth? The road back winds through the echoes of these tales, drawing them together. Could it be that humanity carries within its collective memory the scars of an ancient shared catastrophe? Perhaps the wars of the gods were not divine metaphor, but the recollection of rival civilizations wielding weapons beyond comprehension. Perhaps fire from the sky was not lightning or comets, but the flash of bombs that turned night into day. And if so, then myth is not fantasy but testimony, a global archive of trauma preserved in symbols, encoded in story, passed down across millennia. We read them as allegory because we cannot accept their literal weight. But perhaps they were literal first, allegorical later, as generations forgot the science but remembered the fire. The seeker, burdened with the reward of insight, now carries it into this realm of myth. The road back is a path of reconciliation where science and story, ruins and verse must be woven together. Myth ceases to be mere myth and becomes instead a form of memory. Not all myths describe nuclear war, but enough describe fire from the sky, sudden annihilation, and divine weapons that the pattern grows undeniable. Yet the road back also reveals resistance. To accept these myths as testimony is to fracture not only science but theology, anthropology, and the very framework of human history. Scholars resist not out of malice, but out of fear. For if myths encode truth, then our arrogance in dismissing them becomes another scar, another blindness. Still, the road winds on. The seeker presses forward, the myths converging like rivers flowing to a sea. From the Indus Valley to the deserts of the Middle East, from the mesas of North America to the fjords of Scandinavia, humanity tells the same story. Fire came from the sky, cities burned, gods fought wars, the earth was scorched, and survivors began again. The seeker pauses at the edge of this realization, feeling the weight of it settle like ash. Could it be that all these myths are fragments of a single catastrophe? That what we call local legend is actually global memory? That once, long ago, humanity danced with nuclear fire and nearly lost everything? The road back ends here, at the cliff's edge of recognition. Behind lies evidence, myth, and ruin. Ahead lies a question that cannot yet be answered. Is myth not just story, but memory of a shared catastrophe, one that spans cultures and ages? The seeker stares into that question, knowing that the next step, resurrection, will demand an even deeper confrontation with what humanity has lost and what it risks losing again. Resurrection does not mean rebirth without scars. It means survival against impossible odds, the fragile continuation of life after catastrophe. In the seeker's journey, resurrection comes through the language of genetics, the coded memory not in stone or verse, but in the DNA of every living human being. For buried within our cells are the echoes of collapse, population bottlenecks that whisper of near extinction. Genetic studies of humanity's past reveal strange patterns. Around 70,000 years ago, humanity appears to have gone through a severe bottleneck, with estimates suggesting as few as a few thousand individuals may have survived. Traditional explanations point to volcanic winters, like the eruption of Mount Toba in Indonesia, which could have darkened skies and devastated ecosystems. But DNA does not tell us what caused the bottleneck, only that it happened. What if, hidden beneath geological catastrophes, other forces also played their part? Forces unleashed not by volcanoes but by human hands. Later bottlenecks emerged closer to the dawn of civilization. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age, populations shift dramatically. Hunter-gatherer groups vanished, others consolidated, and entire regions appeared depopulated in the archaeological record. Mainstream history points to climate shifts and the rise of agriculture. Yet myths of fire from the sky, Wars of gods and destruction by unimaginable weapons cluster around this same period. Could the genetic scars we carry be remnants of a war too devastating to record in stone, preserved instead in the only archive that never lies, our DNA?
The seeker recalls the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, where bodies lay as if death struck in an instant, and the tales of the Mahabharata, where entire races were reduced to ashes. What would such devastation look like in the genetic record? It would appear as sudden, sharp reductions in diversity, population collapses so severe that only a fraction of humanity survived to pass on their genes. This is exactly what the bottlenecks show.
Anthropologists speak of missing civilizations, groups that vanish from the record without clear explanation. Some disappear in flood, others in famine, but many leave behind mysteries. Tools abandoned, settlements burned, cultures erased. Archaeology fills the gaps with conjecture. Yet the DNA in our bloodlines confirms that waves of collapse reshaped humanity, repeatedly narrowing the genetic stream, then widening again as survivors rebuilt. Resurrection, written not in myth, but in mitochondria. The implications are unsettling. If humanity once mastered nuclear fire, then these genetic bottlenecks may be more than natural accidents. They may be the footprints of apocalypse. Radiation does not merely scar stone, it mutates DNA, cripples reproduction, and reduces survival rates. If ancient civilizations unleashed atomic war, then the survivors would not only remember in myth, they would carry the consequences in their very cells. Hair falling out, sickness spreading, generations weakened. Over time, populations dwindled until only a few remained, huddling in remote refuges, clinging to survival. Resurrection comes with questions. What survives after apocalypse? Not cities, not monuments. Stone can be melted, libraries burned, temples shattered. What survives is what can endure fire, stories retold and genes passed on. The epics of India, the myths of the Hopi, the tales of Sodom, all are echoes of memory. The genetic bottlenecks are echoes in flesh, proof that humanity has risen from near ruin more than once. And what emerges from these resurrections? Always the same pattern. A humbled humanity, stripped of its knowledge, forced to start again with fire and stone, carrying only fragments of what was lost. The survivors may have remembered flying machines, weapons brighter than suns, cities burned to ash. But without the means to recreate them, these memories became myth. Over generations, myth became legend, legend became story, and story became dismissed as allegory. Yet beneath it all, the DNA remained, carrying silent testimony to the collapse. The seeker recognizes a chilling symmetry. We too live with arsenals capable of bottlenecking humanity. Thousands of nuclear weapons lie in silos and submarines, enough to erase not one city, but an entire planet's future. Scientists call it MAD, mutually assured destruction. But the ancients may have lived it. They may have unleashed such destruction, bottlenecked their populations, erased their civilizations, and forced their descendants to rebuild. If so, then our DNA is not just a record of survival, it is a warning. Geneticists debate how many bottlenecks shaped our species. Some argue for a few major ones, others for repeated collapses. But all agree, humanity is more fragile than it appears. A species that once numbered in millions can shrink to thousands. A world filled with cultures can collapse to a handful of survivors. And from there, resurrection begins. Slowly, painfully, civilization rises again. The seeker contemplating this feels both awe and dread. Resurrection is possible. We are proof of it. But resurrection comes at a price, the near total erasure of what came before. If humanity once mastered nuclear fire, then we are not heirs to their knowledge, only to their warning. We stand where they stood, weapon in hand, future uncertain, our survival hanging by a thread as fragile as theirs. Resurrection is not triumph, It is fragile, tentative, shadowed by the memory of collapse. Humanity survived, yes, but at what cost? Entire civilizations erased, knowledge lost, history reset. The DNA bottlenecks remind us that survival is never guaranteed, and that resurrection is less a victory than a reprieve. The seeker, carrying this knowledge, emerges from the genetic cave with a haunting question. If humanity has resurrected before, how many times can it do so again? If apocalypse has scarred our past, how much apocalypse can our future endure? The cliffhanger hangs heavy. What survives after apocalypse? Stories, perhaps. Genes, certainly. But civilizations, knowledge, wisdom? Or do we begin again and again, rising from ashes, forgetting the fire, only to rediscover it and repeat the cycle? The seeker steps forward, knowing the next stage will demand an even deeper confrontation. With the elixir of origins, the possibility that all of human history must be seen not as steady progress, but as fragile cycles of rise, fire, fall, and resurrection. The seeker now carries the boon of revelation, the understanding that humanity's past may not be a straight road from simplicity to complexity, but a cycle of rise, mastery, collapse, and resurrection. The ruins, the myths, the isotopes, and the scars in DNA converge into one lesson. Humanity has walked the nuclear path before. The elixir returned from this descent is not comfort, but warning. And it is written not only in words, but in stone. Across the world, myths of cataclysm persist not as entertainment, but as memory. The Mahabharata describes weapons brighter than 10,000 suns, survivors stricken with sickness, rivers poisoned. The Bible speaks of cities annihilated in fire from the sky. The Hopi remember a red destructive sun that ended a previous world. The Norse spoke of Ragnarok's flames. These are not random tales. They are warnings, preserved in story so that descendants might remember. Humanity, the ancients seem to say, must tread carefully, for the fire of the gods is too dangerous for mortals. Yet the warnings are never direct. They are cloaked in allegory, framed as the actions of gods or punishments for sin. Why? Perhaps because survivors lacked the language to describe what they had seen. How do you explain radiation sickness to a people without medicine, or nuclear blast waves to a people without physics? You cloak them in symbols, divine wrath, heavenly fire, supernatural weapons. Allegory becomes the vessel for memory. Another possibility is intentional concealment. Perhaps the survivors, scarred by fire, chose to veil the truth, to tell their descendants plainly, "We once split the atom and destroyed ourselves," might tempt them to seek the same power again. But to frame it as divine punishment, as stories of gods and demons, was to warn without instructing. The knowledge was buried deliberately, hidden so deeply in allegory that it could not be easily repeated. Humanity was to remember the fire's consequences, but not its mechanics. The seeker reflects on the irony. In our age, the nuclear story is told with clinical precision, kilotons, isotopes, megadeaths. We measure annihilation in data. And yet, when Oppenheimer sought words to describe the bomb, he reached not for physics, but for the Bhagavad Gita. "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In the end, allegory remains the truest language for apocalypse. Perhaps the ancients knew this instinctively, encoding their warnings in myth so they would endure across millennia. The elixir is this: humanity has already walked the nuclear path once before. The ruins whisper it, the myths sing it, the DNA carries it. And if the cycle is real, then we walk it again now, poised on the same precipice, armed with the same fire, telling ourselves the same lies of control. The warnings in stone are not relics, they are mirrors. And yet, the seeker cannot escape the cliffhanger. If these warnings were so urgent, why bury them so deeply? Why not carve them plainly, shout them loudly, leave no room for doubt? Perhaps survivors feared what would happen if the truth were too clear. Perhaps they understood that knowledge, once given, cannot be taken back. Or perhaps the fire itself erased so much that allegory was all that remained. The seeker emerges into the light of this realization, carrying the elixir of warnings in stone. But the journey is not finished. Ahead lies the trial of interpretation, where skeptics and believers clash, where data and myth are weighed, and where humanity must decide whether to heed the warnings or repeat the cycle once more. The seeker now bears the elixir, the warnings hidden in stone, in story, in the scars of DNA. But every elixir is tested. No revelation is accepted without challenge. The journey demands trials of interpretation, where skeptics and believers, scientists and storytellers clash over the meaning of the evidence. Was it truly nuclear fire that once swept across the ancient world, or are we merely projecting our fears onto the shadows of history? The first trial comes from geology. Mainstream scientists insist that the vitrified forts of Scotland, the fused stones of Mohenjo-Daro, and the glass fields of Libya can all be explained by natural processes. Lightning can melt sand into fulgurites. Meteor strikes can fuse silica into sheets. Volcanic eruptions can release enough heat to vitrify stone. The anomalies, they argue, need not be evidence of nuclear war. They are the fingerprints of nature, not of man. And yet, the seeker notes the cracks in this defense. Lightning strikes are localized, not spread over kilometers. Meteors leave craters and iridium signatures, yet many vitrified sites lack them. Volcanoes leave ash layers and lava flows, yet the Libyan desert glass is found in an area with no volcanic history. The explanations fit pieces, but not the whole. Like forcing mismatched fragments into a puzzle, they leave gaps that myth and ruin together fill more convincingly. The second trial comes from archaeology. Scholars argue that the skeletons of Mohenjo-Daro, found in positions of collapse, are not evidence of sudden atomic death, but of plague or massacre. The radiation readings, they claim, were exaggerated or misreported. The scattered corpses are simply the remnants of ordinary tragedy, not apocalypse. But the seeker recalls the details. Corpses burned beyond recognition, bricks fused together, isotopes in the soil. If it were plague, why the melted stone? If it were massacre, why the fused silica? If it were contamination, why the uncanny alignment with descriptions in the Mahabharata? Each explanation trims away anomalies, but leaves behind inconvenient residue. The mainstream answers quiet the questions, but do not silence them. The third trial comes from mythology itself. Skeptics insist that the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Bible, and the Hopi legends are allegories, not testimonies. They are stories meant to teach morality, not history. Gods wielding weapons brighter than suns, fire raining from heaven, cities burned to ash. These are metaphors for divine wrath, not records of nuclear war. To read them literally, they say, is to misunderstand myth. But the seeker cannot ignore the specificity. Survivors stricken with sickness, hair and nails falling out, food contaminated, rivers drying up. These are not the generic tools of allegory. They are precise descriptions of radiation sickness, fallout and blast effects. The skeptics argue metaphor, but the metaphors map perfectly onto phenomena no ancient should have known. If they were allegory, then why do they so closely describe what we ourselves only rediscovered in 1945? The fourth trial comes from cosmology. Some argue that the fire from the sky found in global myths is evidence not of nuclear war, but of cosmic impacts. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, for example, suggests a comet or asteroid struck the Earth around 12,800 years ago, triggering wildfires, floods, and the collapse of megafauna. Such events could easily be remembered in myth as fire from heaven, as punishment of gods. This trial carries weight. Comets and asteroids can indeed produce devastation akin to nuclear blasts. They can generate temperatures hot enough to vitrify stone, distribute glass across deserts, and leave lasting scars in ecosystems. Perhaps what we interpret as nuclear fire was cosmic fire, yet here too the seeker finds unease. For while cosmic impacts explain some anomalies, they do not account for the language of weaponry. The Brahmastra is not described as a star falling from the sky, but as a weapon wielded by warriors. Vimanas are not meteors, but machines piloted by men or gods. The Mahabharata does not speak of random impact, but of targeted annihilation. The myths suggest agency, not accident. The fifth trial comes from philosophy. Critics argue that to see nuclear war in ancient myths is to project our modern anxieties backward. We live in the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in a world haunted by mushroom clouds, and so we reinterpret every ancient fire as atomic. Perhaps the myths are simply mirrors of ourselves, not windows into the past. The seeker does not dismiss this trial. Projection is a real danger. But projection cannot explain isotopes in soil, fused bricks in ruins, or vitrified forts spanning continents. Projection cannot explain why so many cultures describe not just fire, but sickness, fallout, and weapons. Projection may color interpretation, but it does not create anomalies. The evidence exists, whether we fear it or not. The sixth trial is cultural. If ancient civilizations truly mastered nuclear power, where are the reactors, the weapons, the factories? Why do we find only melted stone, not engines or machines? Without artifacts, skeptics argue, the theory collapses. Technology leaves tools, and none have been found. Yet here, the seeker recalls the nature of apocalypse. A nuclear blast does not leave behind machines. It annihilates them. It melts steel, vaporizes cities, erases libraries. What remains is rubble, fused stone, and radioactive soil, exactly what we find. To demand intact weapons from a civilization annihilated by those very weapons is to demand the impossible. What apocalypse leaves behind is absence, not abundance. The trials mount, each one testing the elixir, each one forcing the seeker to weigh doubt against evidence. None of the skeptic's explanations are unreasonable. Lightning, meteor, volcano, allegory, projection, each could explain part of the mystery, but taken together they explain too little. It is the nuclear hypothesis, unsettling as it is, that binds the anomalies, the myths, and the ruins into a coherent whole. The seeker, battered by these trials, emerges with the elixir intact but tempered. It is not certainty that survives. Certainty is the enemy of truth. What survives is possibility, sharpened by resistance. The possibility that myths are memory, that ruins are testimony, that humanity once mastered nuclear fire and fell to it. The possibility that what we fear today is not unprecedented but remembered. And so the seeker carries forward scarred but resolute. The trials have not destroyed the elixir, only refined it. And now, at the edge of the journey, the final boon awaits, not just evidence, not just warning, but awakening. The seeker looks ahead to the ultimate boon, where myth, science, and philosophy converge into a single truth. That gluons may bind atoms, but it is memory that binds humanity across cycles of fire and resurrection. The elixir survives, the warnings endure, and the question remains, will we listen? The seeker has endured trials of interpretation, wrestled with skepticism, and carried the elixir of warnings through the gauntlet of doubt. Now, at the penultimate stage, comes the ultimate boon, the unifying revelation that ties together myth, archaeology, and science into a single haunting truth. Humanity is older, more advanced, and more dangerous to itself than we have ever dared to imagine. The memory of fire is our inheritance. The great narrative of human history, as told in classrooms and books, is one of ascent. From stone tools to agriculture, from agriculture to cities, from cities to writing, from writing to science, from science to industry, from industry to the atom. But the anomalies demand a different story, not linear ascent, but cycles. Humanity has climbed before. It has reached peaks of knowledge, touched forces too vast to contain, and fallen in fire. Each cycle ends in collapse, and each collapse erases memory until the survivors are left with only fragments. Myths, ruins, fused stones, and genetic scars.
The ultimate boon is the recognition that these fragments are not isolated curiosities. They align. Myth speaks of fire brighter than 1,000 suns. Archaeology reveals skeletons stricken with inexplicable death, stones melted into glass. Nuclear science explains fallout sickness, isotopic ratios, vitrification. Separate, each thread is ambiguous. Together they weave a tapestry too coherent to ignore.
The seeker understands now that humanity is not simply the product of progress, but of amnesia. We have forgotten not only the details of past ages, but their very existence. Civilizations rose, mastered sciences we believe unique to ourselves, and fell so completely that only allegory and anomaly remain. We are not pioneers of nuclear fire, we are rediscoverers. And this recognition is the boon, a perspective that reframes all of history and all of destiny. It also reframes myth itself. What we dismissed as legend, allegory, or poetic fancy may be the last repositories of truth. The Mahabharata, with its Brahmastra and its sickened survivors, is not allegory for divine wrath, but testimony of apocalypse. The Bible's Sodom and Gomorrah are not moral tales, but records of cities obliterated by fire. The Hopi memory of a red destructive sun is not superstition, but survival testimony encoded in story. The myths of Ragnarok, the Aztec suns, the Sumerian tales of godly wars, all echo the same memory, the memory of fire. This boon also exposes the profound fragility of civilization. We think ourselves secure with our industries, our technologies, our satellites. Yet the ancients may have thought the same, and they fell. Their cities turned to ash, their knowledge buried, their people reduced to whispers in DNA. The very fact that we are here at all is evidence that resurrection is possible, but it is also evidence that collapse is real, and that survival comes not with triumph but with amnesia. The seeker stands in awe of the symmetry. When Oppenheimer invoked the Bhagavad Gita at Trinity, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," he was not only quoting ancient verse, he was unknowingly linking two cycles of fire across millennia. The poets of the past and the scientists of the present spoke the same words, saw the same flash, felt the same dread. The alignment is not coincidence, it is continuity. The memory of fire has outlived the civilizations that first unleashed it. Yet the boon is not comfort, it is a challenge. If we are older and more advanced than we believe, then our self-destruction is not hypothetical but historical. If myth and archaeology align with nuclear science, then humanity's greatest danger is not outside us, not comet, not volcano, not cosmic accident. It is within us. We are our own destroyers and always have been. The seeker realizes that the memory of fire is not only a story of the past, it is a mirror held to the present. We live now with arsenals vast enough to erase ourselves many times over. We justify them with deterrence, balance of power, political necessity. But so perhaps did the ancients. The Brahmastra too was said to be forbidden except in dire need. The ancients too wrestled with the ethics of annihilation. They unleashed it anyway, and they fell. Here lies the cliffhanger, the question that cannot be answered but cannot be avoided. If they had the fire once, might others hold it again? Perhaps not only us, but others still hidden in the ruins of history, civilizations erased so completely we do not even remember their names. Or perhaps, even now, cultures unknown to us walk paths we cannot see, mastering forces we barely comprehend. The memory of fire may not be unique to humanity. It may be the price of intelligence itself. The seeker stands on the brink of this realization, holding the ultimate boon, the understanding that the myths, the anomalies, and the sciences all align into one truth. Humanity is not simply the child of progress. Humanity is the child of fire, resurrected again and again, always carrying the memory of catastrophe in its stones, its stories, and its cells. The boon is clarity. The boon is warning. The boon is hope, fragile, tenuous, but real, that if we remember, truly remember, we might yet break the cycle. But the memory of fire is double-edged. To know it is to confront the possibility that forgetting is easier and repeating is inevitable. The seeker carrying this boon prepares for the final step, mastery of two worlds. For only in uniting past and present, myth and science, survival and destruction, can humanity glimpse its true place in the cycle of history and decide whether the next apocalypse will be the last. The seeker has descended into myth, crossed thresholds of ruins, endured trials of science and skepticism, and returned with the elixir of warning. At last comes the new equilibrium, the transformed perspective born of the entire journey. This is not the equilibrium of comfort or safety, but of clarity. The seeker stands between two worlds, the world of the ancients, whose myths whisper of fire brighter than suns, and the modern world, where arsenals of nuclear weapons sit silent but ready. In this moment of mastery, the seeker understands, we are not the first civilization to reach for the atom. This realization changes everything. Human history, once thought a steady ascent, becomes something far more fragile. It is not a ladder, but a cycle, not a line, but a circle. Civilizations rise, discover power too vast to contain, and fall. Their knowledge is buried in allegory, their achievements erased in glass and rubble, their warnings encoded in story. Survivors scatter, their descendants inherit only fragments, and the cycle begins anew. We are but the latest turn of that wheel. The awe of this revelation is immense. The myths align with the ruins align with the science aligns with our own age of fire. The Mahabharata's descriptions of weapons that scorch the earth mirror the testimonies of Hiroshima. The vitrified forts of Scotland resemble the fused stone of nuclear tests. The Libyan desert glass is twin to the trinitite of Alamogordo. The skeletal remains at Mohenjo-Daro echo the shadows burned into walls at Nagasaki. The alignments are too precise to dismiss, too haunting to ignore. But with awe comes dread. If we are not the first, then we are not guaranteed to be the last. If civilizations before us discovered the atom and destroyed themselves with it, then we too may be poised on the same precipice. The cycle warns us, mastery does not guarantee survival. Knowledge gained is knowledge that can be lost. Cities can vanish in fire. Libraries can burn. Populations can collapse into bottlenecks so severe that only fragments of memory survive. What we call progress is not inevitable, only provisional. The memory of fire is always with us, shaping us, shadowing us. The seeker sees now that the new equilibrium is not about comfort, but vigilance. To know that others have fallen is to understand that we too may fall. But it is also to recognize that survival is possible, that resurrection has happened before. Humanity carries the scars of apocalypse in its myths and its DNA. We survived then. We might survive again. Yet survival comes at the cost of forgetting, of beginning again from ashes, of losing everything we thought permanent. The awe lies in survival. The dread lies in the cycle. What emerges then is a paradox. The ancients warn us, but they warn us in allegory. Their ruins testify, but they testify in silence. Their genes carry scars, but the scars tell us nothing of cause. We are left with fragments, and from fragments we must build wisdom. That is the gift of the new equilibrium. Not certainty, but responsibility. For if ancient nuclear war scarred the earth, then the question is not, could it happen again? The question is, are we already repeating the cycle? Every mushroom cloud test in the 20th century, every siloed missile in the 21st, every doctrine of deterrence and balance of power echoes the same arrogance that myths tell us consumed the ancients. The Brahmastra was forbidden, yet it was used. Our weapons are forbidden, yet they are built. The parallels are inescapable. The cycle is repeating before our eyes. The seeker looks outward into the night sky. Stars burn with nuclear fire, binding matter together, lighting the cosmos. We too wield nuclear fire, but ours destroys rather than sustains. Perhaps this is the true trial of intelligence, to harness forces vast enough to create or annihilate, and to choose which path to follow. Perhaps every civilization that rises to this threshold faces the same test. Some may fail, some may survive. Perhaps we are not alone in this cycle, but part of a universal rhythm of rise and fall, knowledge gained and lost, fire unleashed and remembered. The seeker sees humanity now not as master of history, but as its apprentice. The ancients speak to us through stone and story, warning that the fire of the atom is too powerful to be wielded lightly. We stand with their memory in our hands, their ruins at our feet, their myths in our ears. The new equilibrium is not peace, but awareness. We walk with the shadow of fire at our side. And so the journey ends as it began, with awe and dread, with mystery and warning. Humanity is older, more advanced, and more dangerous to itself than we believed. The myths are not only stories, the ruins are not only anomalies, the fire is not only ours, it has burned before, and it may burn again. The seeker, now transformed, delivers the final truth. If ancient nuclear war scarred the Earth, the question is not, could it happen again? The question is, are we already repeating the cycle? Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the cosmos here on Frontiers of Infinity. If this glimpse into the unknown has sparked your curiosity, be sure to subscribe and join us each Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, where we unravel the darkest mysteries of space.